This is Baltej and I'm Bernard. We're doing an experiment on precipitate mixing solutions.
The first solution we mix, which is this one, is potassium chloride mixed with barium nitrate. A precipitate has not been formed. And the second one, which is this one, potassium chloride mixed with barium chloride. A precipitate has not been formed.
Okay, so Baltej is about to put
Sodium carbonate mixed with potassium chloride. A precipitate has not been formed.
sodium nitrate and mixing it with potassium chloride.
A precipitate has not been formed. This one is sodium nitrate mixed with barium nitrate and no precipitate has been formed. The second one is sodium nitrate mixed with barium chloride and no precipitate has been formed. Barium chloride mixed with barium nitrate makes no precipitate. This is sodium nitrate mixed with sodium chlorate and no precipitate. This is sodium carbonate mixed with barium nitrate. And this one is sodium carbonate mixed with barium chloride. Both have formed precipitate. Now I'm gonna mix aluminum sulfate, barium nitrate, which is this. And as you can see, it has got that white milky color, which means that a precipitate has been formed. Barium nitrate, strontium nitrate. It's clear precipitate has not been formed. Bernard is adding barium chloride mixed with barium nitrate. A precipitate has not been formed. I'm going to be mixing barium nitrate, which is with sodium sulfate. And so a precipitate has been formed. This is sodium sulfate that I have right there. And I'm going to add barium chloride. And once the barium chloride is added, a precipitate has been formed. And that is also sodium sulfate that I've put down. And to that one, I'm going to add strontium nitrate. And that one has also formed a precipitate. I have put down barium chloride, and to the first one, to this one, I'm going to be adding aluminum sulfate. So that means that a precipitate has been formed. To the second one, I'm going to be adding strontium nitrate. So let's see. And it's clear, so a precipitate has not been formed. Okay, this is our last mixing of two solutions, and I have put down right there aluminum sulfate, and with that I'm gonna mix in strontium nitrate. So, oops.
A precipitate forms.
A precipitate forms, as Bernard just said. Okay,
I was right.
we're done our mixing.
This is the outcome of our experiment. And that's the conclusion, I think.
Our
Observation.
What is the difference between a molecular equation and a net ionic equation?
In a molecular equation, the reactants products are neutral compounds. It shows the reactants that reacted to make the product or products and the products that were produced from the reactants. Whereas in a net ionic equation, it puts the equation in terms of the ions that are actively involved in the reaction. This is why we don't see any spectator ions in a net ionic equation. The spectator ions that appear on both the reactant side and the product side in a reaction. These get crossed out in the ionic equation when there is no ionic equation. This means that all of the ions in the reaction were cancelled out. They were all dissolved.
What is a precipitate?
A precipitate is a solid that is formed when two liquids or aqueous solutions react. When two ions form a compound having too low solubility, a precipitate forms because of the mixing of the two ions. When the solution has dissolved as much of the solute as it can, which is a saturated solution, the extra or excess solute left over will form a solid called a precipitate. When there's a precipitate, it means the saturated solution has gone past its maximum.
So, I'm going to tell you some of the precipitates that formed. Barium chloride reacting with sodium carbonate produces barium carbonate and sodium chloride. The precipitate that forms is barium carbonate. Barium chloride reacting with sodium nitrate produces barium carbonate and sodium chloride. The precipitate that forms is barium carbonate. Aluminum sulfate reacting with barium chloride produces aluminum chloride. The precipitate that forms is barium sulfate. Sodium sulfate reacting with barium chloride produces sodium chloride and barium sulfate. The precipitate that forms is barium sulfate. Sodium sulfate reacting with strontium nitrate produces sodium nitrate and strontium sulfate. The precipitate that forms is strontium sulfate. Aluminum sulfate reacting with strontium nitrate produces aluminum nitrate and strontium sulfate. The precipitate that forms is strontium sulfate. Barium nitrate reacting with sodium carbonate produces barium carbonate and sodium nitrate. The precipitate that forms is barium carbonate. These were all the precipitates. There were 7 precipitates in total. An equation that doesn't form a precipitate is as follows. The reaction between strontium nitrate and barium chloride produces strontium chloride and barium nitrate. There was no precipitate that was formed in this reaction. The products are all soluble, which means that the solution has not reached its maximum saturation point. If the molecular equation for barium nitrate and strontium nitrate were broken down into individual ions in an ionic equation, all ions on both sides would be cancelled out because they would be the same. This tells us that no precipitate was formed. This solution has a much higher solubility than one that does form a precipitate because this solution still dissolves more solute. It has no net ionic equation because all of the ions are cancelled out in the ionic equation and are considered as spectator ions and do not form a precipitate. An example of an equation that forms a precipitate is as follows.
Sodium sulfate and barium nitrate react to produce sodium nitrate, and a barium sulfate precipitate was formed in this reaction. The formation of the precipitate means that the solution formed between sodium sulfate and barium nitrate is saturated. The solubility of this substance is gone beyond its max capacity of how much substance can be dissolved. It cannot dissolve any more solute. Because it has passed max capacity, therefore it leaves the formation of undissolved material. A saturated solution forms when the dissolved substance is in equilibrium with some of the undissolved substance.
So that was our video lab discussion. Thank you for watching.
See ya!